time in Minsky, so then they do a summer school where they train students from all over the world, a Minsky summer school. They do lots of good policy-oriented work up there. So I got this fellowship through Christ College in Cambridge, and at Cambridge University, I came to the Levy Institute. Randy Ray was there. I had met Randy, I think, once before. That is not true. I had known Randy for a while. Jeez, it's been a long time, guys. I spent time at the University of Denver, so I had known Randy because before going off to Cambridge, I spent the equivalent of two quarters there on the quarter system at DU. And I took a bunch of courses. I didn't pay any tuition, so I didn't get any credit. But they graded all of my assignments and treated me just like a regular student. I was just sort of, it was a dress rehearsal for grad school, I guess, before going off to Cambridge. So I did get to know Randy there. And then I ended up with the fellowship to the Levy Institute. Randy's there, and Godley is there. Minsky had passed away, but he's still sort of there. And Matt Forstatter was there, and this is where Randy was working on his book, Understanding Modern Money, which was one of the first attempts to lay out in a popular sort of way, a short, kind of readable book, the principal tenets of MMT. And Randy was working on that book, and the inspiration really was a guy by the name of Warren Mosler, who we all ended up being hugely influenced by. And what's interesting is this is not an economist by training. I mean, he has an undergrad degree in economics, but he made his career as a guy who operates in financial markets, and he really understood things and he saw things differently. I think because he hadn't been trained in economics, so he didn't
more of an empirical kind of how do things actually play out.
Exactly. He's watching the world around him. He's watching traders. He's thinking about markets in a different way, and he didn't have the intellectual baggage that had been foisted on him through years of graduate training, and he didn't need to be reprogrammed. He just came in with a fresh look. And the first time we read a little pamphlet, it was a little thing that Warren had written. He called it Soft Currency Economics. And it's really where you started with our conversation about governments being the issuer of their own currency. And Warren's point was it's a quote soft currency, not a hard currency. It's not a gold standard anymore. So we have this thing called fiat money. It's not tethered to anything that's physical or finite. It's a floating currency. And the policy space that's available to countries that have this type of monetary arrangement is just fundamentally different from actors that don't have that, like Greece or the state of Kansas or you and I or whatever, right? So Warren's putting out these arguments in the form of this little pamphlet, and we all end up reading it. And it's just, first you resist it because this can't be right. It's just simple almost, Somebody would have noticed this before if this was correct. So you start pushing back a little bit. Then you start revisiting the literature, and you find that it's in Keynes and it's in the work of Alex Lerner, and you just start reading Adam Smith, and all of a sudden you start persuading yourself that you have made a huge mistake in, you know, the way that you've been thinking about really big questions in economics. And so those are some of the early influences.
So you touched on this before. Most people are so consumed by the idea that what's good for the individual in terms of finances is also good for the economy, for the government as a whole. For example, common things that people think that we need to balance the government budget like we would balance the household budget, as you mentioned earlier. Why is this type of logic just essentially wrong?
Well, it's wrong because I sometimes just put it as simply as I can think to put it, which is capitalism runs on sales, right? Without sales, there can be no customers in the, you know, businesses in the economy. Without customers, there can be no revenue, and without revenue, there can be no profit. And capitalism is a profit-seeking enterprise. So you gotta have this engine of growth thing happening, which requires profits to happen. So imagine that, you know, you're paying your workers, they get an income, and they have to decide what they're going to do with the income. A portion of it is gone right away because of taxes. So some of the dollars that have been paid out to workers, they can't return to businesses buying goods and services because it's drained out because you're paying taxes. Then suppose you decide you're going to set something aside. Maybe you have the luxury of making enough money that you can actually save. Millions of Americans don't have that, but a lot of them do. And every dollar that you decide to save instead of spend is a dollar that can't be captured by some business, can't become part of their sales, their revenue, and their profits. So that's another, we call them leakages, right? It's a demand leakage. And then every time you buy something that's produced somewhere else in the world, not here domestically, that dollar leaks out of the economy's called the circular flow. So you got all these leakages happening. The problem is, if you don't do anything about those leakages, then businesses watch the customers disappearing. Their inventories rise. They don't have the demand to keep producing at the same level. So what do? You say, I guess I produced too much. I need to scale back. So they fire some workers. They produce less. They let old machines wear out and they don't replace them. And the economy contracts and languishes and stagnates. So what you have to have is some form of injection on the other side, some replacement for the taxes that are drained away and the savings that's drained away and the imports. So where can those come from? Well, the rest of the world can buy some stuff from us, but right now, that's not happening, right? We buy more from the rest of the world than they buy from us. So we have a net drain there. Businesses can invest, and investment spending will replace some of that lost demand. But why would businesses invest if they don't see the customers because customers saving? So who does that leave? It leaves the government, right? You're the last great hope to put some demand into the economy to keep the economic activity at a level high enough to keep people employed and keep the economy growing. So that's a long answer to a kind of a short question, but that's it. You can't behave. You know, they tell households all the time, just save, right?
Yeah.
Save.
I mean, if you could, I mean, it's again an old idea, but so important. The paradox of thrift. I mean, if you want to explain that, I mean, it's pretty much what you just stated, but what's interesting, if everyone was to save, what would happen?
That's exactly right. It is what I stated, but I didn't call it, I didn't give it the wonky wording, but that's a Keynesian kind of a description, right? What is the paradox of thrift? Well, it's a paradox, Keynes says. It's a paradox, which is, it's a puzzle, right? right? Thrift means saving. So there's this puzzle about saving behavior. And what it is what's good at the micro level, if you spend less than you make, that's good for you because you're able to save for things like retirement or an emergency or something like that. But if everyone in the economy behaves that way and closes up their wallets, puts away their checkbook, locks up their credit cards, and refuses to go out and spend because everyone's trying to save more, the economy as a whole gets clobbered, right? Because of all that lost demand. And all the government does is add to the agony if it refuses to do the replacement demand, deficit spending, and says, well, I'm going to behave just like you, right?
I think you compare. We were talking to Steve Keen in our last episode, and this might be maybe a too simplified explanation, but the funny analogy or comparison that he made was if the government balances budget like a household, then all households would have their own printing press in the basement.
Well,
Like if you want to complete that analogy, fine. Yeah, there's a household budget, but you have a printing press downstairs in
Yeah.
the basement where you can.
yeah, exactly. So
that.
people say, well, the government's going to end up with debts that it can't
Right.
pay. You're going to be unable to service your debts, bondholders. So you have treasuries, right, the national debt. You're not going to be able to make those payments. Or you're going to have Social Security at some point in the future where you're not able to make those payments. You don't have the money. Well, right, because as you said, right, you've got a patent essentially on the U.S. dollar. It's like a platinum patent on the dollar.
Yeah.
You've literally given yourself the exclusive right to create the currency. No one else in the world can create the U.S. dollar legally, right? People who try go to
You can't have that printing press in your house and be in trouble.
Exactly. So if we don't have that, it would be amazing if we did, because we would never have to worry again about how are we going to pay the electric bill, or which, how am I going to put my kids through college? It would just be cha-ching, cha-ching, right?
Nice.
And but it is a fundamental difference. Having the patent on the dollar means never having to ask, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, let's push you on that then. Let's play devil's advocate, because we're often told that larger government spending will crowd out the private sector. That's like the argument, right? Leading to less overall investment, but slower economic growth. So what's wrong with that kind of thinking? What does it miss about the government's unique position?
Well, let's talk about what we mean by crowding out, because normally when economists use that term, they're talking about money. They're talking about crowding out financing. So what they have in mind is, in economic jargon, it's a loanable funds theory. And what it means in simple terms is they think that money is finite, that there is some pile of savings that, people have decided not to spend some money. They put it aside. It becomes part of the savings that are available. And if you're thinking of U.S. dollar savings, picture a pile of dollars in the world. And everybody who wants to borrow dollars to fund things beyond what they earn has to go to that pile, and they want to take a piece of it, right? So everyone's in competition for the same pile of finite, limited U.S. dollars. So if the government wants to increase spending, but it doesn't raise taxes to offset that spending, then it's going to run a deficit. And under current law, when a government runs a deficit, it has to go out and borrow. So people think that means that the government goes into competition with everybody else who's trying to borrow dollars. and there are only so many dollars available to be loaned out. And so the additional competition drives up the price of money, which is to say the interest rate. Okay, so crowding out in economic jargon works through the bidding up of interest rates. And then the argument there is that firms will therefore borrow less because money is more expensive, right, at a higher cost. And to layer on an additional assumption, as everyone knows, government spending is far less efficient than private sector spending. So not only do you crowd out private investment, but you crowd out the more efficient, more desirable, right, better kinds of spending. You said, what's wrong with that argument? What's wrong with the argument is that they've got money completely backwards. So they're thinking of money as a finite substance. They're trapped in a gold standard world. They think that there's a pile of coins, right? That when people say you have to find the money, that question or statement conjures up an image already of something that's out there in a physical form, and it scares, and you have to go and get it, right? And there are other people who want it, so there's a competition for it. When in fact, modern money doesn't work like that. I don't know, you talked to Steve, you had a whole conversation, I'm sure, about endogenous money and how banks create money and all this kind of stuff. So we, as a profession, have failed. We have failed our students, we have failed policymakers, we have failed punditry that is designed journalists who are supposed to help the public understand important issues. Economists have not stepped up and gotten this right.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. So you can kind of see how politicians get their advice from sort of the mainstream economic, academic community, and then the press, inevitably gets, what they're covering from that sort of framework. But in your view, is it just because mainstream economists have been, educated and trained in one particular way, and they really can't see out of that framework? Or do you think, let me push you and say, do you think a lot of them sort of know that a lot of their models and the way they look at the monetary system is probably flawed, but they're so indoctrinated into this sort of framework that they're afraid to step outside. Their careers depend on it. What do you think is going on? Do you think it's a blend or a mix of all those things?
I do. I think it's a mix of those things, and I can say that because of personal conversations with people who have different experiences like you just described.
Yeah.
So, I have a very good friend who has been an economics professor for longer than I have.
Yeah.
And he started off teaching. When you get your first teaching job and you adopt a textbook, you're very inclined to stick with that textbook forever. As long as there's a new edition, you never change. Yeah. Because your lecture notes always work, and once you go to all the trouble,
building a syllabus is a big investment.
It's a huge investment of time and resources, and once you get your lecture notes, from my cold dead hands, right? Am I going to ever teach this any differently or revisit this? And I do have a really good friend, and I said to him once, why do you keep teaching this stuff? Because he said to me, I read your latest article, it makes me want to change the way I'm doing. I said, well, what are you doing? He said, I'm just teaching all the, usual money and banking. I said, how can you do that, And he said, it's just so much work, It's just so much work. So I know there's that, but I also know that and this is a completely different kind of motivation. There is something professionally risky about talking about certain things differently from the conventional wisdom. So when I was at Cambridge, I'll name a name here because I don't care. I've told this story before. I was at Cambridge and I was taking a graduate macro theory course, and you get 15 or so professors coming through, cycling through over the course of the year. And it happened to be Boyder's turn. Now, Boyder, England, he became chief economist at Citibank. Right, this is a big name. And so, Dylan Boyer is the professor who's teaching ISLM theory. Never mind, right? And so I'm sitting there, and I'm in this big class, and there's nothing critical at all being said about this model and so forth. And I'm sitting there kind of stupid because I was just dangerous enough. I read Minsky, I'd spent time with Randy Ray. I knew where the weaknesses are, So I raised my hand, and I thought, everybody in this room should know that we should talk about this. So I raised my hand and I posed some question that had to do with loanable funds and money, and he turned red in the face. Not embarrassed red, angry red. Like, that was not welcome. And he looked at me and he made an example in the class. And he pointed at me and he said, if you are the type of person who wants to talk about money and thinks that money is important, you are probably the same type of person who would enjoy beating yourself with a rubber hose. Now, he's Dutch, so it sounded better.
Yeah.
But the point is,
We can stitch the Dutch action on
it was meant to put me in my place and to tell me there are things one does not talk about. And this is where, again, with Steve King, if you're talking to Steve King, you must have had conversations about how insane it is to try to do economics without talking about money and banks. As if you can have a functioning monetary, financial economy.
Yeah. Remember the Krugman-Keene debate that was going online for quite a while.
They're absent from their models, and they want to keep it that way, right? And anybody who tries to intrude with a question or suggest, that might suggest that that's actually not to the benefit of those trying to model the real economy are not welcome in the club.
It's amazing because if you just ask a layperson, what does an economist do? They're like, oh, they're experts on money and finance, and it's...
Yeah, it's really, the icing on the cake of that story is that this is before the financial crisis, because this was 96, 97, when I was there. After the financial crisis, Boyder becomes one of the leading voices, and he's writing all these pieces in the Financial Times and other places, trying to explain what happened, trying to explain the financial crisis. This is a guy that didn't want to talk about money.
So to go back to sort of the political theater and talk and sort of lexicon around this whole fiscal responsibility. One of the most glaring contradictions when it comes to fiscal responsibility is from self-proclaimed deficit hawks in both parties, both Democrats and Republicans. Which is the insistence on, continually, as we mentioned, increase, well, let me reframe that. They continually sort of preach this thing like we need to increase defense spending, versus trying to expand social programs for example, lower income or marginalized groups, or, for example, creating universal health care or federal jobs guarantee, something along those lines. So there seems to be this sort of like cognitive dissonance going on in the minds of politicians, where there could be an enormous deficit generated from something like military spending, while there's all this talk about cutting social programs. So what do you contribute to this ability of politicians to so blatantly contradict themselves when it comes to spending? We're talking about politicians specifically here.
So, I spent some time on the Senate Budget Committee. I know the weaponry that the deficit has become, the ways in which the budgeting process becomes so politicized. And yeah, if you mentioned wanting to put more in defense, or wanting to put more in education or something else. So if you're operating, in this game where, you say, either I'm committed deficit hawk and I'm a real true believer, and there are, I think, a couple on the deficit committee who are, right? Then you say, these are my priorities. The budget reveals my priorities. Now, I want to put more money into infrastructure or education, the so-called discretionary component of the budget. But I also care about the impact on the deficit. I genuinely do. And so I need to offset that somewhere else. And so I go for, let's say, defense spending. That's the obvious target where Democrats often will say, well, so we're going to cut defense, but we're going to do it in order to be able to put more money, devote more resources here. Others, I think, maybe less committed actually to the principle of balancing the budget, but view that same strategy as just convenient because they really want to take a whack at the defense budget because they think it's too big. We spend too much. We have too much of a militarized, right? And they want to reduce it so that it becomes just convenient cover to say, this is a guns and butter choice, people. And this is what, principles of economics teaches you, that resources are scarce. And if you want to have more butter, things like education and infrastructure, then you have to give up some guns. And there's a trade-off here.
So do you think, talking about sort of current times, do you think after, we passed this big tax,
hasta la misma eternidad, donde perdure nuestro amor, porque tú eres toda mi felicidad.
Are they gonna now, you think, go back to their former deficit talks or fear-mongering in order to now, maybe cut Social Security or other
Yeah, see, that's the thing. They didn't need to manufacture a so-called deficit crisis in order to go after Social Security entitlements. That's an end goal anyway.
Yeah.
They have two jobs. There are three jobs. Reduce regulation, deregulate the hell out of everything, cut taxes, and get entitlements, right? Go after entitlements. So, but they didn't need to be able to so-called blow up the deficit in order to say, oh, isn't it a shame that now we have this deficit? They were going to do that anyway. They were going to go after entitlements. So here's what happened. I was reading this morning about this retreat that's taking place with the Republicans, starting yesterday. And so they get together and they say, what should we do next? We got tax cuts. What should we do next? So Paul Ryan is reportedly talking about how you're going to go after Medicaid and some other safety net programs. And he said, but we're not going to use the deficit because they know what we're going to do. That's what they think we're going to do. So, we're not going to blame it on the deficit because after all, they just did this huge tax thing.
Right? Threw that card away.
Yeah, so that's what they're thinking we're going to do. So we're actually going to work on new language. And this is crazy, but this is what they do. So they'll get Luntz or somebody to come in and help them frame this whole thing, so that they can please the Koch brothers and others, and they can deliver on the next part of the agenda, which is, gutting entitlements. So they're figuring out how can we sell this to the public in a way that doesn't involve, we have to do this because of what we just did to the deficit. So we have to call it, we're not going to call it workfare. So they're playing with the language. And they're saying, how can we label this thing so that it sounds like kinder, gentler, we're doing it for your own good kind of thing. We're just trying to help you,
Which is amazing because now instead of making an example out of that, there's a lot of Democrats who are now playing the role of the deficit hawk and kind of saying, this new tax bill is going to add, whatever it is, $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion.
Yeah, but that's in the past. Look, they grabbed at everything they could find in order to oppose that. Now, I don't think they spent as much time talking about the impact on inequality.
Should have been inequality.
I think that they definitely played the deficit card far more often. But the Republicans are not done yet. I don't think they're done adding to the deficit. They're talking about infrastructure now. And the Democrats aren't saying we can't spend any more money because the deficit. They're saying if you're going to put more in defense, which they're also, by the way, saying we want to do more defense spending. Democrats are saying, parity, don't forget, every dollar of additional spending that goes to defense, we have a thing, right? Yeah. This has been our deal. We've been doing $1 of defense and $1 of non-defense discretionary type spending. So Democrats are saying if you're going to spend more, you got to spend more on the stuff we want too.
Amazing. Going back to Paul Ryan and the Republican Party at large, kind of the use of language. You had a really great moment in one of your presentations where you took a snippet of Paul Ryan speaking to Alan Greenspan and trying to push the privatization of Social Security. I think he used, again, it's probably cold language, right?
Personal retirement.
Personal retirement accounts. Can you explain Greenspan's response to that and kind of how it relates back to what we're talking about right now?
I can. Your listeners should Google Greenspan and Paul Ryan on Social Security and watch it. It's so great. I showed this to audiences every time I
when
did
I
a
heard
talk.
it was
right.
big grin.
And what's funny is Paul Ryan asks one question, and it's actually, if you pay attention, it's one sentence, but it goes on forever. And he uses the phrase personal retirement accounts 4 times when he's asking the question. Now, this is under oath. Alan Greenspan is sitting there. This is back when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve. So he's sitting there under oath. And Paul Ryan is asking a question. He says, look, don't you agree with me that now is the time to begin to move toward a system of personal retirement accounts, because as we all know, Social Security is going broke, and so we have to do things today. Don't you think personal retirement accounts can be a way of securing with personal retirement? Just like, come on, right?
Get to the point.
I have teed this question up for you. All you have to do is say yes. That's the answer I'm looking for. Just say yes. And to his great surprise and dismay, Alan Greenspan did not just say yes. He actually told the truth. He leans into the microphone and he says, well, I wouldn't say that Social Security is insecure. The benefits are insecure the way they're set up today. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. And at this point, this is the best part of the video, because Ryan, you just see all the color drain from his face. He cannot believe now what's happened, right? The genie's out of the bottle. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. What did Greenspan do? He took the affordability question off the table. He said, we can talk about Social Security. We can talk about the challenges ahead, but we can't talk about it in the context of we can't make the payments, because we can always make the payments. So what was Greenspan's point? And this is what's really important. If we were actually having this debate in this country, it would be so important and so fascinating to have everybody weighing in to try to solve this problem. And so what Greenspan goes on to say is, the question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created, which those benefits are employed to purchase? What does that mean in everyday language? It means, how do you make sure that the U.S. economy is going to be productive enough in 5, 10, 20, 30 years, so that when we make payments to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled, that when the checks show up in the mail or the digital entries show up in your bank account, that you can turn around and spend that money into an economy,
an actual
and
good.
there's stuff to buy. Because what Greenspan is doing is focusing on the fact that demographics in this country are changing. The boomers are moving out of the workforce and into retirement. So they're making stuff today, they're producing, but soon they'll be consuming and not producing. So how do we figure out how to deal with a situation where we're going to have fewer people left behind working and producing stuff, but all of these retirees are still going to want to consume stuff? And it's not a problem as long as you have a productive economy. So what are the investments that we should be making today, knowing that this is the challenge of the future, that will make sure that the U.S. economy is as productive as it can be in 10, 20, 30 years? I would say R&D, infrastructure, education. We know what the things are that increase long-term productivity and long-term prosperity. We're just doing all the wrong stuff.
You just had a New York Times article in the op-ed section recently. Can you talk a little bit about how community health centers and healthcare, investing in healthcare, adds to long-term productivity and actual growth?
Yeah, I think so. That piece came out just a couple of days ago, I think. And it was in response to the State of the Union. And so I just chose to take the infrastructure piece because, what people heard Donald Trump say in the State of the Union was 1.5 trillion in infrastructure. That's what people heard. Okay, what does
that look like, right?
What does he really mean? What do the Republicans really mean? They're talking about, we know this from, I guess, a leaked document that lays out a sort of blueprint for the way that they're thinking about infrastructure investment. They're thinking about around $200 billion of public money, right, government funding. So out of 1.5 trillion, 200 billion in actual government spending. So where does the rest of it come from?
Yeah.
Some of it, the expectation is that state and local governments are going to pony up. Well, good luck, right? Especially with what's happening with the tax bill in terms of, right, high tax states and so forth. And so, that's a problem. But anyway, a lot of it is going to be private financing. That's what they have in mind. So private equity and other investors who are supposed to come in and fund large-scale infrastructure investments. Anyway, and we could talk about what the problems with that are. But you asked about my op-ed, and so I said, well, why don't we think about community health centers? We have community health centers all over this country. We could have a huge build out, and that's infrastructure investment. We build hospitals and schools, that's infrastructure.
Right.
You build community health centers as part of the infrastructure spending. And why would that be important? Well, you could make community health centers free and accessible to everyone in America. So I cited some work done by a woman who's a friend of mine, who's a former ER doctor. She does a lot of work in this area. She has a proposal with its community health centers at the center of the proposal here. And so what she says is, look, at any point in time, 75% of the population only needs primary care. And so what you want to do, everybody talks about the high cost of health care, but none of the proposals that are bandied about really get at cost. And she's saying, take primary care out of insurance. It doesn't belong there. You insure things that are high cost or rare events. Primary care is stuff we all need. They don't meet the usual criteria for why you buy insurance for something. So make these things, and she says, make them like Starbucks. They're everywhere. And they're of a certain high quality. They're nice. And they're facilities that you can walk in. No, there's no billing. There are no co-pays. Everybody gets a card. Everybody has access to these. And they're free and they're everywhere. And it deals with primary care. And she's saying add dental, add mental care. And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm listening to the president's speech, and I think, well, what if we did, as part of infrastructure, this huge build-out of community health centers, and then we also address things like the opioid epidemic, because these can be centers for care for people who are dealing with, addiction and that sort of a thing. So that's...
Yeah. I encourage everyone listening to check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to kind of change directions a little bit, but you have a new report that just came out called The Macroeconomic Effects of Student Debt Cancellation, which was published through the Levy Institute. And it makes a pretty powerful case that canceling student debt would give the economy quite an economic stimulus. Can you take us a bit through the general questions that the report set out to answer and some general findings? And then also I have another follow-up question here, which is, and maybe you can get to it in your answer, but the interesting way that the student loans themselves are distributed between private and public accounts, where it really wouldn't be spending more in this cancellation, since the government holds or already has spent some of this money. So yeah, just take us through that report, some interesting points, at least, some of the main points.
Sure. So this is a report that I'm not the sole author on this report. There's a co-authored report. Yep. One of my former colleagues at UMKC, Catherine Rushlin, Marshall Steinbaum, who is at the Roosevelt Institute, and Scott Fulweiler. And Scott did the heavy lifting in terms of this report. All of the accounting, really detailed questions about how do you actually go about, canceling student loan debt. I mean, we're talking about removing things from balance sheets, right? And they exist all over the place. So how do you actually do it? What are the mechanics of eliminating or canceling student loan debt? So what the report did was ask a simple hypothetical. What would happen if it all just went away? And so we were approached with this question by a couple who, they both are graduates of UC Berkeley. They have done very well for themselves, and they're looking at this problem and they're saying, my God, 44 million Americans are trapped with student loan debt.
That's what, 1.4 or 1.5 million?
It's about,
trillion,
yeah, you're right.
Yeah, sorry, right?
$1.4 trillion. So there's more student loan debt than there is credit card debt, right? It's the second largest component next to home mortgages.
Just so among this table, I think we have how much in about student
Close to
debt together?
150. Yeah, you're looking at like a sizable house standing in front of you.
We have the best
Anyway,
So, like I said, they went to Berkeley. And they went to Berkeley at a time when it was essentially free to go to Berkeley. And they're saying, this is just tragic what's happened to all this generation of young people. And, what would happen if we just somehow found a way to make it so they didn't have to pay it back, right? And they could start their lives and so forth. So they came to us with this proposition, this question. Could you look at this as economists, and could you do some sort of macro analysis and tell us what would be the economic impact of doing this? So I said, yeah, we could do that. I assembled a team. They had Mark Zandi of Moody's agree to allow us to use the Zandi model to do some of the simulations. So we put the data in, and then the Zandi model does some forecasting for us. We did that, and we also used it's called the FAIR model. So that way we would have the analysis run through two different models, so it would be sort of the findings would be robust. And, basically it does what any reasonable person would expect it to do. So if you told people who on average have about $30,000 in student loan debt, you don't have to pay that back. And what happens? Automatically it comes off of your balance sheet. So if you think of a liability, a big liability disappearing, what happens? Your net worth goes up by the same amount. So now you've just become wealthier, right, on paper. You have increased your wealth. And what else happens? Every month, instead of pulling out your checkbook and writing that $500 and whatever check to service your student loan debt, you can do something else with that $500. Right? What would you do? Maybe you'd eat out a few more times. Maybe you would make other purchases, buy other things with that money. Maybe you'd pay down some other debt, maybe you'd save a little bit, but I'll bet you'd spend an awful lot of that money. You'd find other ways to spend that money. And so
Yeah, maybe you'd move out of your house.
yeah, maybe you'd move out of your
Wait,
parents'
no, I'm sorry.
basement.
Millennials just like to live in the
Yeah.
basement of their parents' house.
Right.
It's not that we're sitting on piles of cash in that basement.
Maybe, you know, you are a young couple. Maybe you're not like so many people who are struggling with student loan debt, and you think, I can't get married yet because we can't afford the wedding.
Yeah,
We can't
yeah.
afford the house. So you put off starting your life. You put off starting a family. Maybe you have one child, but it's all you can do to deal with the expenses associated with childcare and raising a child. So you say, we want to have another baby, we can't afford it. We have the student loan debt, we have all this. So you can imagine
So
all of
many
those
ripples
things.
to the
I'd love
economy.
to start a business, but I can't get a loan because I have all this student loan debt. I can't. So what we found is that, it would do about what you would expect it to do. You get a boost because you have a wealth effect and an income effect. And both of those things working together provide a stimulus to the economy. So it works almost like a tax cut because it frees up disposable income.
Right.
But it works as a good kind of tax cut because it's targeted at the right people, right?
Yeah.
We're not targeting the people in the top 1%. They didn't take on student loan debt. You're targeting, everybody else. And so what the report shows is that a lot of good stuff happens and nothing bad happens. That's the simple way to put it. What would happen if it were inflationary, if it drove up interest rates because the Fed had to react to all this additional inflation? Then you say this may not be a good idea, right?
Yeah.
But the models tell us that that's not what happens. What you get is an increase in real economic activity, unemployment goes down, growth goes up, inflation is modestly impacted, very small increase. And by the way, the Fed's been trying to get inflation up, so they might actually say thank you, thank you.
Hear about it
So
every day.
And then again, I mean, just to circle back to it too, what was so striking to me was the point that any student loan debt that's held currently
Right,
by
right.
the government, right? It's really
Right.
not a cost.
Yeah,
just
right.
what they make in interest.
Exactly. No,
If you
you
want
got
to line that out,
You
please.
got that exactly right. I skipped that part of your question.
No,
I'm
no, no.
sorry.
No, it's fine.
So yeah, the thing is that almost all of the 1.4 trillion in outstanding student loan debt is already on the government's books. And so it turns out that it's much easier to dispose of that piece of it because the government just says, you know what, don't send any more money. Right? You're not paying this back. You have a bit that is privately issued and some of it that's private but government backed. That's small by comparison. So you're looking at around 1.2 trillion of the total. Yeah, that's already on the government's books. So you're just dealing with the other piece of it. And then the government figures out whether it wants to service those loans, take over the payments essentially, or
For the private ones you're talking
yeah, or just buy them and cancel them. Yeah.
And then the government is setting up new programs, contracting private debt collectors to collect these student loans. So it seems like it's just this tautology of logic. That
Yeah, they can
they're-
fire the debt collectors.
Exactly.
They'll save
There
a
you
lot of
go.
money.
Save some money. So we talked to Steve Keen back in January. This is going to go back to this question of a debt jubilee, and he said. We talked to Steve Keen back in January about some of these issues surrounding things like the monetary system, how money is created, and the impact of private debt on financial instability. One of his propositions was a kind of QE for the people, like we just talked about, for students. instead of injecting these large sums of money into the financial institutions that essentially went into assets and did little or nothing for the real economy, perhaps debt forgiveness and fiscal stimuli into areas of the economy where working people are most affected would provide this kind of boost politicians and economists constantly expound that they want. What are your thoughts on this larger kind of debt jubilee, and how could that play out in practical terms?
Well, I have to know exactly a little bit more specific what we're talking about. I mean, I just basically described for you a form of, if you want to call it, people's QE, because in the paper we go through two ways to do that. One way would be for the Fed to buy the loans. Okay, so that you could, I think that would qualify as, what these people are describing as people's QE, have the Fed buy it and then forgive it. So I'm sympathetic to the idea because we just wrote it up in the paper, and I think it fits.
So you think that could apply on a larger scale? Because his point too was obviously, as I think you would agree with, the high private debt levels, are make economies ripe for financial crises. So it's not only just like the moral thing to do, but it's also kind of like the fiscally responsible.
Yeah, but
thing
here's
to do.
the other way to go about it, right? And I think that maybe politically going after debt of a variety of types.
Yeah.
I think the reason it works with student loan debt is because you can associate the policy to with a specific policy failure, which is, look, it used to be free. You didn't have to pay to go to public colleges and universities. It was free. It's going to be free again. Tennessee, New York, Catholic states are already moving in that direction. It's these people who got trapped in the middle of history, where they had the misfortune, right? They had the misfortune of being bookended by governments that got it right, and they got trapped in the middle. And because they got trapped in the middle, and they went to school at a time when, we failed as policymakers to make, to provide the funding. So I get that you can say, because we did that to these people, we're going to fix it. Okay, we created this problem. Now, I don't know that you could persuade me that we can talk about, debt jubilees of a variety of kinds in the same way. I think, for me, it just works better to say we're going to push people's incomes up so that they can get rid of the debt, and then we're going to restructure the economy in a way that people don't actually have to take on debt in order to meet, the obligations that people normally have to take on, health care and child care and college and all those things. This is why people get, driven into debt. So I would probably be more inclined to say, let's do things that raise and push up incomes, and then let's restructure the economy in ways that take the burden off of people for retirement, for health care, for housing. We have to do a lot of things in a lot of different markets.
I think about a fifth of mortgages are held at the Fed too, right? So, yeah.
So, we obviously talked about this earlier, but I think it's really important just to drive the point home for some of the folks listening. What exactly is the logic behind? I kind of wanted to get into specific sort of policy areas, right?
We saw through the Bernie campaign that a lot of people were encouraged in fighting for stuff like universal health care, free public higher education. So what's the logic behind that, like, we or the government simply cannot fund programs like that? Like, what? So another way to ask it is a lot of our listeners, or a good portion of them, are progressive activists, organizers, people working on a variety of economic and social justice movements and issues. And some may be sitting here listening to you, and they might say, like, wait a minute, now that I know all of this, like, what the hell have I been arguing for, for the past few years? Because you realize that once you start from that premise or paradigm of debating, like, how much do you need to pay for things like universal health care, etc., as we've seen, in most cases, you're going to lose that argument. Right? So I know you're an economist, but what do you think for people trying to work towards pushing these policies? What do you think is the political messaging? Maybe not so much about strategy, but maybe political strategy, if you will, to get this framework out to people in a palatable, accessible way. And what's the best way to start injecting this into our political discussion and start demanding of our policymakers and politicians to understand this as well?
It's such a big question,
Yeah.
and it's I don't know if this is your last question, but if it is, this is the question to end on. This is the biggest question. I'll try to take it piece by piece. I'm working on 2 books at the moment. Both are aimed at popular audiences, and both, I hope, will empower people like the kinds of people that you've just described. I mean, it's not a book written for policymakers, but it's a book designed to change the policy narrative. It's not a book written for activists, but it's a book designed to empower activists in these conversations. And so I'm doing things through that channel to try to be of use. But, if you're talking about people pushing, and so you've got the Fight for 15 movement, or you have, any number of things, activists surrounding protecting Social Security. How should they approach policymakers? How should they argue for resources? Right. Is that kind of, in this, because education, there is this belief that it's a zero-sum game. And the only way that I get more money, that I persuade policymakers to put more money in my agenda area, is by showing them that there's some other less worthy thing, right? And so what you often hear, at least this is my experience, is organizations coming in and arguing for resources and tearing down somebody else as the pay for, as the and so one of the things, first step is recognizing that the federal government, this is policy, this is politics. It's a political choice. It is, do you have the political will to fund this? But that the government cannot fund everything, and it cannot fund every request at the level that's being asked. Why? It's not because they can't come up with the money to do it. We know that's not the reason. The reason is that the economy has its own constraints, its own kind of internal speed limit. And if you just start willy-nilly writing checks, saying, oh, you can have money for this and you can have money for this, and then groups start spending into the economy, you will get an inflation problem. So there has to be some budgeting mechanism that provides discipline. That's important.
Well, just to jump in there, because we have a few more questions, but we wanna give you some time. What are the limits to government spending? You just mentioned inflation. I think you had people, just to reference Paul Krugman again, I think we talked about him, I'm not sure where he kind of came out, and I'm not sure if he switched his position on it since then, basically said, as per like the MMTers, this sort of level of government spending could create, high inflation or like potentially hyperinflationary situations.
So look, you have a government with a fiat currency. And as Alan Greenspan said, there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. That's not Kelton, that's not MMT, that's Alan Greenspan for crying out loud.
Right.
So they already know this, okay? They already know this. The limits are in the real economy. They're not in the pile of cash that sits in the world. That's not how the world works. Modern money is created by fiat. Okay, so what are the limits? The limits are in the real economy. So right now, if Donald Trump says, let's do 1.5 trillion in infrastructure.
Yeah.
Let's do it over the next 3 years. My first question is not how are you going to pay for it? My first question is, how do you know 1.5 trillion is an appropriate number to spend into the U.S. economy over the next 3 years on infrastructure? Have you bothered to look to find out whether we have the labor that can be mobilized? So do we have people with skills in construction? Do we have engineers? Do we have architects? Do we have the necessary skill, the machinery, stuff to move, heavy stuff and dig and drill and build and cranes? Do we have the capital? Do we have the capacity? Does the U.S. economy have the capacity to absorb 1.3 trillion in infrastructure investment over the next 3 years? Do we have the slack? Do we have the resources? These are the questions that matter, not, where will we find the money and can we spend it in? So if he said, let's do 1.5 trillion in infrastructure and let's also do these tax cuts and let's also do, and you start putting together a huge, ambitious fiscal agenda, and you haven't bothered to figure out whether, the economy can handle all of that at once, you're going to get an inflation problem.
So I just want to drill down here because that word inflation, it's written in all of financial material, or if anyone picks up any newspaper or is interested at all in the economy or not, right? You're going to see that word. Can you give us the simplest illustration of how inflation occurs and what it is? I can still remember in my first class, very simple, but was that it was when too many dollars are chasing not enough goods. And for me, that kind of was an insight, obviously much more complicated than that, but it really allowed me to wrap my head around this term that seems to carry a lot of baggage. Could you give inflation?
It's actually a whole lot more complicated than that makes it sound.
Absolutely.
Right? So, but that is the quick and dirty definition. That's the sort of Milton Friedman, Chicago school definition. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That's what Friedman said. And that meant that, prices go up when you have too many people with too much money looking to spend it and not enough goods available. Too much money chasing too few goods. That's how lots of people describe inflation. Turns out inflation is much more complicated. We don't measure the prices